Hello, welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. Hi, Matthew Lucas.
And I'm Stephen Ryan.
Oh, it's brisk, Stephen.
Yes, and we put up a video every week, so what we do for our art is amazing.
So do hit subscribe if you want to know of our continuing adventures. Now, Stephen, why are you dragging me out in a field with freezing feet this chilly winter's day?
Well, we're actually in a local park at Mount Macedon called Centennial Park, which was established for Victoria's centenary, as in the state, not as in the person.
Yes.
And we're coming to visit a tree specifically.
And could it be this one?
And in fact, it is this one that is here right near us.
And let's see if we can turn around. Ta-da! And I will just pan up. Look at that tree. All right, well, let's go and learn a little bit more about it.
What a good idea.
I have to say, as we're walking towards this, the shape is extraordinary.
Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful tree.
All right, tell us everything, Stephen.
All right.
Tell us everything.
Well, botanically, it's an oak, and it's Quercus, robur, fastigiata.
Quercus, robur,
fastigiata.
Now, I think fastigiate means
upright,
column-like.
Yes, so that's easy. And Quercus robur, of course, is what we would call here the English oak, although that's a bit presumptuous because it doesn't just grow in England.
It grows in Scotland and Wales.
And it also grows in Europe.
Ireland.
Yes.
And Europe.
And Europe. So we would call this a pencil English oak, and this particular specimen is around about 100 years old now. It's on Victoria's National Tree Register, so it's seen as an important specimen of its type. And plants end up on that register either because they're rare, or they're an important feature within the landscape. And they're the two major reasons for that.
And this one isn't rare because it's easy enough to buy, isn't it? But
it's
the age and the beauty of this one.
And the importance of the actual specimen itself. I mean, it's a particularly good specimen. I don't think I've seen better specimens on my travels overseas.
Really?
There's much older ones in Europe and in Britain and other parts of the world where the tree would have developed, probably, so there'll be much older ones. But I think this one holds its own against all of them as far as the shape, form and size and beauty of the tree.
It is extraordinary. So let me just ask some questions then. So Quercus robur, is it a guarantee that if you were to grow this from acorns, from seed, that it's going to be the upright version, or is it variable?
No, it's variable. So if you're going to grow it from seed, I mean, you can graft them, and that way you can be assured of a nice narrow form every time.
So you're saying this could grow into a regular spreading oak if you grew it from seed and it wanted to do that?
Yes. So it could easily do that. But I have to say, if you do raise them from seed, within probably a year or two, they'll start to show their characteristics.
So true colours.
Yes. So you'll find that the fastigiate ones will have very upright side branches and will have already a quite pencily form. Others that aren't going to grow so pencily will have started to branch out. And in fact, I know of at least one specimen around here that's almost an intermediate. It's sort of almost an egg-shaped one, which is probably not really the way you want to go because it's neither fish nor fowl.
Yeah. So in nature then, would this just have been like a mutation, a form, and it's been selected? Yeah.
So it would have, I don't know for sure, but it would have either been a seedling that somebody found in the wild, or it would have come up as a batch of seedlings that was raised in a nursery somewhere. And again, it's a matter of a sharp-eyed nursery owner who would then turn around and say, "Oh, look what I found."
The money in that.
Yeah, that's right.
But I guess the bigger question, or the biggest application now, is that as gardens are shrinking, as available land is shrinking for people in the cities, finding trees that have a very columnar habit is really important.
And certainly also out in the bigger landscape, using them in streetscapes and things where they need something that has height, but they don't want something that comes out and sort of engulfs the buildings too much. So we will in fact at some point do a story just on fastigiate trees, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But this is one that I think is worthwhile as a standalone story because it's just a beautiful tree.
I'm going to need fastigiate trees in our house because we've got a narrow garden, but I do want trees at the front. So
there we go.
We'll work on that.
You should employ a good consultant.
I should. If only I knew one.
Yeah.
But Stephen, call me old-fashioned. Isn't this deciduous?
Yes. How do I explain this? The English oak is in fact a deciduous tree, but this particular specimen, and dare I say there might be a little bit of hybridity going on here, I'm not dead sure, but it always holds its leaves well into the winter before it turns and sheds. It does become bare by sort of midwinter. We're at the beginning of winter at the moment. Its foliage is just starting to yellow, so it's one of the last of the English oaks around here to turn and shed. So it might have a little bit of Canariensis in its bloodstream or something else going on there that's making it that little bit slower to shed its foliage. But, you know, it's an individual and it has its own attitude to things.
Dancing to its own tune.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, given that this is a European tree, is it generous in its habitat? So could you grow it in a more Mediterranean climate? Are oaks tricky like that? I mean, I know some come from the Mediterranean. I think we're going to look at one later on that is a Mediterranean. But what about these sort of colder European species? Are they able to take different temperatures?
They're very, very forgiving. I'm not sure where climate change is going to take us with some of these trees, but certainly we've been through a millennial drought that lasted for about 12 years.
And this one is still here.
Yeah, and the oaks have turned not a hair when it comes to surviving that sort of event.
And to put that in context, here in Australia, that in Melbourne and Victoria, that was severe. And in the city of Melbourne, the street trees across the whole city were at the brink of dying, and there had to be emergency measures to water all the street trees of Melbourne because it had basically not rained for years.
Yeah, well, virtually a decade.
But this tree is still here and survives.
Oh yes, so oaks as a whole, I mean, you can't say anything too sweeping about a group of trees that I think is something like 300 or 400 species. So there's going to be exceptions to the rule. But as a group, the oaks are remarkably hardy and deserve a lot more attention in the landscape, I think.
Well, I have seen this being planted a lot, and I was just commenting to you that luckily that you won't be around in 100 years because you think you've planted quite a narrow column tree, but in fact that's quite broad now. But that's the benefit of a century of growing. So how widespread are they? Are they everywhere? Are there Australian oaks?
No, we don't have any native Australian oaks. The oaks are mainly Northern Hemisphere. There is a few species that sneak down through Mexico and sort of sneak down into northern parts of South America. But the vast majority of the oaks are European, Asian, and North American. That's where most of them come from.
So they didn't decide to travel south. Interesting, isn't that?
Now, it's probably got something to do with continental drift. Yes. So there you go.
Well, I think without further ado, we should go and look at that tree that's right in front of us, which is a different sort of oak altogether.
Yeah, just to give a sense of the diversity.
Let's go.
All right.
Well, I must admit, I thought this was an olive tree, Stephen.
It doesn't look much like an oak, but this just goes to show a little bit of the diversity within this huge genus. This is the Holm Oak, Quercus ilex. It's a European Mediterranean tree, so you'll see it growing down in the south of France, all through those parts of the world. And it's one of many evergreen oaks. People don't seem to think about oak and think evergreen.
No.
And I have to say this one is a particularly beautiful specimen of its type, but Holm Oaks can also be used as windbreaks, hedges. There's lots of different ways in which you can use these trees in the garden or in the greater landscape, to be honest.
Now, given that they're a Mediterranean tree, viewers, we're not in the Mediterranean. I can attest to that because my feet are freezing. What's its hardiness level then?
All right. Well, you probably wouldn't grow it far north in Scandinavia, but anywhere through most of the Middle European parts of the world. It will certainly grow in most of North America. So it will grow in a wide range of climates, and it would certainly grow down into Central America. It would grow down to certainly areas around Morocco and further south, and it'll grow in most parts of southern and western Australia. So it's got a very wide distribution that it could be grown in.
And this is a beautiful tree. So how old do we reckon this one is?
We'd guess this one to be around about 100 years old.
Right.
So yeah, so a reasonable age now. I mean, oaks are for the future. They could be here in another 100 years or even maybe 200 years. So wonderful, wonderful trees, and something you can plant for posterity, in fact.
And are all oaks long living? I mean, are some, like the Mediterranean ones, less long living?
Most oaks are fairly long living. There are some shrubby oaks that come from some of the islands in the Mediterranean and things that may not in fact live as long. But I think in general oaks are really long-lived plants. So yes, you can have them there for your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and maybe even the next lot down.
And a Holm Oak, we're used to oak as a timber for cabinetry and building, etc., shipbuilding in the glorious days of the Elizabethan sailors. What about Holm Oak? Is that timber used commercially?
I think all oak can be used. Whether it's actually used commercially, I'm not dead sure. It's certainly a lot of these things, because they're slow growing, if they are useful, they've probably been overused as periods have gone by. So maybe you can't get commercial Holm Oak anymore, but I'd be very surprised if it wasn't used as a timber in one way or another.
Yeah.
All right, well, we can see that the bark on this Holm Oak is quite rough and fissured. It's actually quite corky in a sense, which is interesting because there is, of course, the cork oak. And it would be a very useful bark if you're in a Mediterranean style climate that was prone to fire, because it would probably scorch the outer bark, but because it's so nice and thick, it would protect the cambium layer and the tree should be fine.
Let's talk about sex, baby.
Yes.
How does this one go about that act?
Well, in fact, all oaks have male and female flowers.
Yeah, and I think there are some remnant
flowers on this. Of course, the male flowers produce pollen, and they tend to be little dangly bits,
like catkins.
Catkiny sort of thing, and they have pollen in them, so when they're ripe they go yellow. The female flower, of course, is much smaller than the male flowers at that point, and it actually grows into the acorn. So there you go.
I didn't know that.
Well, you do now.
Well, now I do. Oh my goodness. So, all right.
Yeah, well, so it sort of makes sense when you think about it.
My world has just expanded, viewers. Who knows that acorns were ladies?
Yes, that's right. Well, the female flowers of the oak tree anyway.
Yeah, who knows if they're ladies or not. Well, this is a very beautiful tree. I'm glad that we have braved the slings and arrows of this awful weather to go and have a look at it.
And in due course we'll do other stories about oaks, because there's a lot of things that we need to discuss about this group of plants.
And the Holm Oak, I must say, is used quite a lot in contemporary planting in Australia, because it's so tough, isn't it? So it can also obviously take drought and the heat.
It can, and that's actually one of the things that is really interesting about oaks. A lot of them are very drought tolerant, very heat tolerant, also comparatively cold tolerant. And in an Australian environment, they're actually a very useful tree, particularly on acreage, because our own native trees, many have lots of resins in them, and they're very, very, very prone to fire attack, and they explode with fire. Oaks are actually a very good fire retardant. So if I were planting a row of trees around my house to protect myself from wildfires that are becoming more and more common in Australia,
and other parts of the world.
Yes, and other parts of the world, I'd be very tempted to use one of the oak species.
Would it recover if it got a good burning?
Depends on the species to an extent, and about how much damage has happened. I lived through the Ash Wednesday bushfires in 1983 here at Mount Macedon. Many of the oaks got singed over the top. They stopped the blast of the fire. The twigs and outer parts of the tree died off, but the centre of the tree grew back. But if in fact they had a very thick leaf litter or mulch around the base of the tree that burnt, it would sometimes burn the bark around the base of the tree and ring bark the tree. The tree would survive for some years, but it would eventually succumb.
Well, that has been surprisingly interesting, Stephen, and I'm still getting over the fact that it's the female flower that becomes the acorn. I don't know why I didn't know that, or why it's a surprise, but I don't know.
But there you go.
It's extraordinary. Well, we have explored oaks. We will explore oaks in greater detail.
We'll have to. It's a huge genus, so we'll have to come back to oaks in due course.
But not next week.
No, we'll do something else.
What could we be doing next week, Stephen?
I have no idea. But we will be back next week, and it'll be another story of gardening daring do.
Daring do, which won't involve standing in damp, cold fields in leather-soled shoes, getting very cold. But viewers, if you want to see what we're up to, do hit subscribe. We post every week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Yes, by all.